someone to say that this country was great before 1965 requires, above all else, that one be in almost every instance white. Because before 1965, this country was a formal system of white supremacy. It is an informal one today, but it was a formal apartheid country. And that's not my opinion, that is an inarguable fact.
This is the third of 20 events around the life of Martin Delany. Today is Martin R.Delany's 200th birthday. An amazing person in history that you can find little of in the history books. In the newspaper on your seats is an introduction to his life, is an article by him. All of the 20 programs are described in full, so I'm not going to go repeating any of that. And we're going to start today, actually, with a poem. Kamika Williams Weatherspoon is a professor at Temple, and when I was trying to reach Tim, I said something to her, and she said, "Oh, he was at Temple. I can help." I just love her poetry. And she said, "Oh, let me start the program with a poem." I said, "Oh, what a great idea." So please welcome Kamika Williams Weatherspoon.
This piece is called Field Notes, North Philly, Beirut, Badlands. Daughter says, "It's so sad, so depressing down there. It's hard to care when all you can do is take care of your own. Make sure it doesn't happen to you." I told her then, "You sound like a Republican. Lift oneself up by one's own bootstraps when, for all too many of them, their boots, like the sneaks on a wire, are tattered and torn and don't pull up any higher because it was designed for them not to be that long." One. So when their daddy came back from Nam, instead of a job, he was handed a gun and told to fend for himself and be the one to lift the family out. When heroin and smack ceased to be the designer drug of the avant-garde, and in the hood, Mary Jane was more than a name. And pretty soon, cocaine became crack, and whole generations were gone. Two, when a teacher in the hood has 36 students to a classroom with few resources and even fewer books, look, it's no wonder when the day becomes a way to just keep order. One disruption and pretty soon you're off the hook. Three, when Latchkey Ronnie can't read in the 3rd grade and there's no one home to help him with the book. By the 5th grade, either indifferent or class clown, one embarrassment was all it took. By 15, 13, Ronnie's hanging out, posting on the block. By 15, Ron is in the ground, and he's got his own Glock. By 18, there's already 2 bodies on his gun, and the long arm of the law catches him either dead or incarcerated by 21. Same thing with Triniza or Quadisha or Celicia, force-fed images of video vixens and gangster rap since she could talk, bounced and jostled from lap to lap. She grows with conviction in her walk, finding love or at the very least lust in all the wrong places, dripping traces of cum who came and went, leaving behind baby daddy's tattoos across her breast, and even more babies who must learn how to crawl up and out the garbage with all the rest. See, if they had just said, "We enslaved those people because we needed their free labor," and left it at that, Then when it was all over with, there would be no lingering racial prejudice assigned to the color black. Not everyone can lift oneself up by one's own bootstraps. The paradigm is flawed. Although there will always be exceptions for whom we must remember and laud, but legacy is by definition not localized. And if it's not localized, then it's systemic, and we can never be allowed to forget that if we ever hope to remedy it. Education, access, resources, jobs, the opportunity of time. That's why we must stand firm, diligent and determined, but my God, not benign. There is no magic bullet. Just like there's no one reason why. But let's call a spade a spade. Hope is bulletproof, despite the challenges to me and mine. Ladies and gentlemen.
We are so pleased tonight to have with us Tim Wise. Michael Eric Dyson said of Tim, one of the most brilliant, articulate, and courageous critics of white privilege in the nation. He was recently named one of 25 visionaries who are changing your world by Udney Reader. He has spoken in 49 states on over 600 college campuses and to community groups across the nation. He has also lectured internationally in Canada and Bermuda on issues of comparative racism, race and education, racism in religion, and racism in the labor market. His newest book is called Dear White America, A Letter to a New Minority, and on and on. It's also in your program. Please welcome Tim Wise.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I clearly need to come to Philadelphia more often. And the reason I say that is that in the last couple of times that I've been here, I've gotten the most amazing introductions that I've gotten anywhere, at any time in 17 years on the road. So to have Kamika do the poem, first of all, is a real honor. And when she contacted me several weeks ago to ask if that could be done, I said, we're going to make that happen. There's absolutely no question it would be my honor to have her do that. And then earlier today, when I was speaking at the Unitarian Church, I was introduced by the choir, did this amazing hymn. I mean, it was just a very unique way to be brought onto the stage. And then the last time I was in town, which is actually the first time I think that I'd met Kamika, was at Temple, and Malefi Asante did this wonderful introduction of me there. In fact, he postponed a vacation that he and his wife had been planning so that he could do it. So that too was just an incredible honor. And so I feel a lot of love in this city, and I appreciate the opportunity to come back and to share some thoughts with you. Now, having been told within the last half hour that several of you have seen me speak before, and several times for quite a few of you, I now have to sort of scramble in my brain to figure out what I can say that's new. I don't want to be redundant. I don't want to give you the same stuff that you can see on YouTube. I really don't know what's out there because I don't try to watch my own stuff. So I don't know what I'm going to say, if it's out there, if you've heard it. I'll try to make it somewhat unique. I will start out by doing something that's relatively rare for me. So you might want to write this down. You might want to tweet this. You might want to burn this into your memory in some way, shape, or form. I'm going to start off by doing something I rarely do, which is I want to thank people who I know are not in the room, but who are out there in the larger society. I want to thank the fine and upstanding members of the Tea Party movement. And you're going to understand, you're going to understand why I'm doing this in just a second. I want to thank them because in spite of all the disagreements that I have with them, obviously on issues of policy and everything, I do want to nonetheless thank them for once and for all making it impossible to say the thing that white Americans so often say when we talk about race, making forever obsolete That line that we've all heard at some time or another. You know the line that white America uses when these issues come up, this idea that we ought not speak of these things because all of this is in the past, all of this is something that happened a very long time ago, and at some point, we have to move into the future. We can't get stuck in the past. We have to live in the present. It's very hard to continue to say that kind of thing when you have a political movement running around wearing Revolutionary War costumes, powdered wigs, carrying muskets, and speaking in Old English at their rallies. I would suggest to you that when you were doing that, you were in no position to tell anyone else to come into the present and to get out of the past, because by definition, you're still hanging around in about 1774, 1775. So I want to thank the Tea Party for rendering forever obsolete this throwaway line, this deflection line that so many of my people over the years have used when we do not want to have an honest discussion about race. You see, they've proven for us that the past matters, right? And that some people really like the past, so much so they want to go back to it. That's what they tell you. It's not what I tell you. It's not words I've put in their mouth. It's words that they say every time they're in front of a microphone, and even not so in front of a microphone. They tell you they want their country back, and now we are left trying to figure out what that means. And I want to talk a little bit about that tonight, because it seems to me that we're at a very interesting point, a very dangerous point, a very dangerous moment in our historical trajectory, particularly around issues of race. And so we have to have a clear-eyed understanding of where we stand and why. And I would suggest to you that it is much more complicated than the media would have us believe, and even than the media would allow me to explain. I am fortunate enough to have some opportunities to speak on these issues on CNN, MSNBC, a few other places. And on those occasions, I always take those opportunities because it's important that we have an anti-racist narrative in the mainstream media, and yet it's always frustrating for me, as I'm sure it may be for you when you watch these conversations in the mainstream press, because whenever you talk about American politics, whenever you talk about race and racism, you have people who would, in the course of a 3-minute, interview or a 4-minute interview, and boiling it down to 30-second or 45-second sound bites, ask very simplistic questions in search of even more simplistic answers. And so usually when I talk about these issues and the Tea Party movement, the conservative reaction and right-wing reaction currently afoot in this country, the easy question that the media would have me attempt to answer, and perhaps would have others attempt to answer, is very simple. Is the Tea Party racist? And they just sort of put the microphone in your face. Go, you have 20 seconds. And what I think we need to be very clear about as we move forward in this country, talking about issues of race and what we're going to do in the next 10, 15, 20, 25 years to address racism and institutional white supremacy, is we cannot find ourselves sucked into a simplistic conversation where it is, are these people racist and are these people not racist? We've seen how we've gotten sucked into that with regard to the discussion around the Trayvon Martin shooting and George Zimmerman. Is he a racist? Is he not a racist? As if that were really the conversation, as if the conversation were not much deeper than that, right? A conversation about how all of us have been conditioned to see Trayvon Martin exactly the same way that that individual did, the same way that those police did when they left his body in the morgue for 48 hours and didn't tell his parents, because after all, his life was no more important than roadkill on the side of the street in Sanford, Florida. And so that's a social problem. It's not a George Zimmerman problem. It's not an individual, is he a racist, is he not a racist problem. And the same is true with the larger right-wing reaction in the country. It is not as simple as saying, is the Tea Party racist or not? I would suggest to you we actually need a different language to explain where we are right now as a country. And that language has to be rooted more in an understanding of what I would term, for lack of a better phrase, white racial resentment and white racial anxiety than racism per se. Use words like racism itself, and I use it when it's appropriate, and it's a good word, and it's an important word. I think white supremacy is a better one because it's a more accurate one. But nonetheless, if we're going to use the word racism, let's at least understand that what we're really looking at is deeper, more complicated, more nuanced. It is white racial anxiety, white racial resentment. It is not that the Tea Party and its members and that the right in this country are all racist. It is not that racism per se is the driving force behind modern conservative politics. However, I think if we pay close attention to what is happening in the country, we can see very clearly and hear very clearly that the background noise of that narrative, the backbeat of that narrative, is one of white racial resentment and anxiety, a desire articulated quite openly to return to a mythologized and glorious nostalgic past, a past that only members of the dominant white racial group in this country could look at in a nostalgic fashion and look at as if it were a good thing. And so that is what we're talking about. And there's plenty of evidence for this notion of white anxiety and racial resentment. What is that? Well, think about a year ago, there was a general social survey that was released middle of 2011. And it was fascinating because what this survey found, they had asked questions of white Americans and black Americans and Latino Americans and Asian Americans, right? And the questions had to do with an attempt to gauge pessimism and optimism. So these were questions asked of all these different folks from these different groups as to how they viewed the future. Were they optimistic about their opportunities? Were they optimistic about the next 10, 15, 20 years in terms of jobs and education and just life in general in America, right? When they asked white folks and black folks and brown folk of all shades these questions, it was fascinating because African American folk were, according to this survey, and not even by a little bit, by a lot, were the most optimistic group in the United States. White folks were the most pessimistic group in the United States. People of color other than black folks were somewhere in between these two poles. Now, I want you to really think about that. And I want you to ask yourself how that happens. Right? How is it that the group that is the most pessimistic is the one that continues to have approximately 87% of all middle management and above jobs in the private sector, 87% of all tenured faculty positions, 85% of all public teaching positions, right? Half is likely to be unemployed. 1/3 is likely as black folks to be poor. 20 times the net worth of African American families on average. That's what the typical white family has. $100,000 more on average in net worth relative to the typical black family and also the typical Latino family. 18 times the net worth of Latino families. And yet those folks, with all of that disproportionate power, with all of that disproportionate advantage, still the most pessimistic. And those folks who were at the bottom of that structure, twice as likely to be unemployed, 3 times as likely to be poor, 1/20th the net worth, double the rate of infant mortality, double the rate of low birth weight children born to moms as moms in the white community, 9 years less life expectancy, are the most optimistic. That doesn't make sense, right? If we're just looking at objective facts on the ground. If you are in the best position, you would think you would be more optimistic. That's just logic. If you're in the worst position, you would assume you'd be more pessimistic, and yet that isn't what's happening. So why? Why is it that despite these disparities, that despite the ongoing disproportionality of power and opportunity and well-being among white folks, whites are still the most pessimistic? Clearly, there is something we have to examine here. Something is happening despite the objective facts on the ground. Something apparently, in the eyes of white America, is changing. Despite all that disproportionate advantage, there's something afoot that white folks can't quite put their finger on. They can't quite get their head around, at least some of them, and that perhaps is what's leading to this anxiety. And I think there are at least 4 pillars of that white racial anxiety. There may be others that you can think of, but I think there are 4, and we need to understand the way that they interact with one another. Because if we understand these 4 pillars of white anxiety, we can get a better bead on what is happening in white America with this sort of collective existential nervous breakdown that so many of us seem to be suffering over the last several years. There are 4 things happening all at once, you see, that are bringing this about. Any one of them alone might be sufficient to create problems in our republic, but all 4 at once absolutely create sort of the perfect storm for white racial anxiety. And if we don't understand how these factors create white racial resentment, anxiety, and backlash, we're not going to be able to figure out ways to respond to that and to move forward and create real multiracial, multicultural democracy. So here they are. Number 1, maybe the most obvious, and so I'll get it out of the way first. I actually think it's the least important, right? The first pillar, the election of a man of color as president. Now, for some, that may not be a big deal. But let's not pretend that for millions of white folks, that is hard to get their heads around. Not just that a black man is president, but a black man with a quote-unquote exotic name, who doesn't fit the profile, so to speak, of all those other presidents. He doesn't have the chiseled jaw and the cowboy hat and the ranch out west, And he has an exotic name, and he grew up in Hawaii. Is that really a state? People wonder that. You think they don't, but honestly, go back to the election of 2008, the campaign, and you'll remember perhaps Or maybe you didn't see it, but it was interesting at the time. Cokie Roberts, right? This is a registered Democrat. Her mother and her father before that were congresspersons from New Orleans, Louisiana. She is, for all intent and purposes, liberal, whatever that means. It means absolutely nothing, obviously. Right? And there she was on one of the Sunday talk shows, and you may recall Barack Obama during the campaign had gone taking vacation in Hawaii where his grandmother was, and at the time she was dying. Right? So he went to have a vacation and see his grandmother who had done so much to help raise him. Right, particularly after his mother had passed. And so here he goes to Hawaii, not to go surfing, right? Not to buy t-shirts on Waikiki, right? He was going to visit his family, and yet Cokie Roberts, the liberal Democrat, who I have absolutely no doubt voted for Barack Obama in 2008, there's every reason to assume she did, she nonetheless said without any sense of irony or misgiving in front of millions of viewers that it was inappropriate for him to take his vacation in Hawaii because it was too exotic. And he should take his vacation where normal Americans vacation. Her words. And just so you know where that is, it's Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. Myrtle Beach, that's where real Americans, normal Americans go. So this was a liberal Democrat essentially putting out this narrative that there's something not quite right about this man, not quite American about him. After all, we know his father isn't even African American. He is straight off the continent, for God's sake. Right? So there's something very different. It challenges a lot of white folks' ideas of who the leader is supposed to be, what they're supposed to look like, what their biography is supposed to consist of. So that's the first pillar. For some folks, very hard to get their head around the fact that the primary image of America beamed around the world, the most prominent image, the individual who will, for the world, represent the United States of America, at least for that 4-year period of one presidential term, is a black man named Barack Hussein Obama. That's the first pillar of white anxiety. Now you add to that the second pillar, and then you start to see how it gets even worse, right, for some folks. So the second pillar of anxiety is what? The economic meltdown, because for the first time in 75 years, really going back to the Great Depression, 3 full generations, maybe 4, depending on how you count generations nowadays. For the first time in roughly 75 years, white folks have been looking over the last several years at the prospects of what? Double-digit unemployment. That isn't new for everyone. It's not new for black folk, it's not new for Latino folk, it's not new for Southeast Asian folk, it's not new for indigenous peoples. For all of those groups, double-digit unemployment has been absolutely normative every day, every week, month, and year since data was kept on these things. But for white folks, it actually is quite new for white Americans living today, unless you remember and were old enough to have actually had a job during those days of the Great Depression, which would make you quite, senior indeed. You won't remember that, what double-digit unemployment looks like for whites as a group. Right? And so I want you to think about that. We've had 3 generations roughly of white Americans who have grown up assuming that would never happen to us, that couldn't happen to us. It may happen to them, you see, but not to us. Because we're playing by the rules and we're doing everything right, and somehow we are immune to that. We are entitled to the best of everything. And now as the economy melts down over the last roughly 5-year period, you have white folks who are starting to look around and realize that the country they thought they knew, that the world that they thought they knew, the economy that they thought they really understood, maybe doesn't operate exactly the way they thought. And so now you add to having a president of color challenging the image of what America is, the economic insecurity with which most whites have not contended for a very long time, and you can understand immediately how that would create a real crisis mentality. The idea that you could work hard and play by the rules and your kids would be better off than you were. Black and brown folks could never take that as a given. Black and brown folks could never assume that, because they always understood they could work hard and get nowhere. They always understood that, but white America had the luxury of believing in it. And now, as that seems to not work the way it used to, that becomes a source of anxiety. The third pillar of white anxiety, and it's one we don't talk a lot about, but I think it's interesting and I think it's important, right, is the transformation of popular culture in the United States, right? So of all the things that haven't changed in the United States with regard to race, the economic power structure, the educational system power structure, right? The corporate power structure, the justice system, all of those things that we know haven't changed. The one thing that I think we could probably agree has actually changed pretty dramatically in the last 20 to 25 years has been the popular culture, the representations within popular culture, right? We are no longer that country that we were 27 years ago when MTV wouldn't even play videos by black artists, except for Michael Jackson. That was who we were when I was just a teenager. We're not talking about a really long time ago, right? 25, 26, 27 years ago, we were a far whiter popular culture. The icons, the folks on the posters in the kids' rooms, the people you'd see on television and in movies were overwhelmingly the same as they had been 20 and 30 years ago. Now, we are a popular culture thoroughly multicultural, right? Where you have folks who are country music artists making records with hip-hop artists. What? That's crazy. You have Blake Shelton and CeeLo on the same television show. What? You know, that's crazy. Right? So we live in a society where young people are growing up with a popular culture that is so much more thoroughly intertwined that you really can't pull any one thread of that culture out without having the whole garment fall apart. Now, that isn't sufficient to change the power structure of the society. We understand that. That doesn't actually change who's on top and who's not in the larger society, but it does cast a very different glow over the culture as a whole. And one of the ways that white supremacy has been maintained is by having the ability for that dominant group to know that it defined the culture and the culture defined and reflected it. And when that is no longer the case, because now that culture is shifting and the contributions of people of color to that culture are becoming ever more apparent, particularly to the young, you can imagine that there will be some white folks growing up in a society where they could take the culture for granted as theirs, right, who would then look around and say, once again, something is changing and I don't know that I like it. Right? Because the pop icons don't look like me, and the people on my kids' posters on their walls, they don't look like me. They don't have backgrounds and narratives like mine. In other words, starting to really realize that that normalcy that white folks have been able to take for granted is being challenged not only by the president, not only by the economic insecurity, but also by the cultural transformation of the larger society. And then finally, the fourth pillar of white anxiety, probably the most important, and when you combine it with the other three, right, it has this exponential impact, is the demographic shift currently underway within the United States. We know, if we've been paying even a little bit of attention to what demographers have been telling us for at least 15 or 20 years, and they tell us again every couple of months, we know that within 20, 25, maybe 30 years at the outside, right, that approximately half of this country's population are going to be people of color, and half are going to be white. Now that's a fact, and it doesn't matter what folks think about it. It doesn't matter if they like it. Right? I know there are some white folks in Arizona, as I joked around this morning in the church, who weren't real happy about it, but I'm not real worried about them. I was in Arizona recently, and I can tell you without fear of contradiction that the average age of white folks in that state's about 137. So, you know, tick-tock, right? With a little patience and some decent community organizing, we'll probably outlast them. Right. And I say, and I'm not advocating, by the way, the death of old white Arizonans, so please don't tweet that. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that everybody dies, and age is pretty highly correlated with that particular condition of being. So I'm just playing the odds, right? But what I'm saying is that we're still going to have to do the work, though. Understand, just because one generation will pass into the night, so to speak, doesn't mean that equity and justice in Arizona or anywhere else will suddenly be upon us. The demographic shift is real, and it's going to certainly change the look of the country. But we also have to remember that white South Africans held on for a very long time, and they were only 6% of the population there. So I'm fairly confident that 50% white in the United States, if they so choose to cling to their privileges, to our privileges and advantages and institutional power, can probably figure out a way to do it. And therein lies the danger, right? Because as that demographic shift happens, and as white Americans are confronted with the reality that we can no longer take our normalcy for granted, so much that we've been able to take for granted, right? That we were the prototype of an American. We were the floor model of an American, right? We were, and when you use the phrase all-American boy or all-American girl, we knew what people saw. I used to do these experiments with people in workshops. I stopped doing them because I think they might be unethical. But, I mean, there were no electrodes or anything. There was nothing like that. No torture devices. But I used to do this thing where I would go in and I would give people a piece of paper, and I'd draw a line down the middle, and on the left-hand side I'd put a big W for white, and on the right-hand side POC for person of color, and then I would give them this piece of paper, and then I would give them all pins, right? Sort of like, just rollerball pins or whatever. Just you can get them at Office Max, just real simple, right? But I would tell them, right, that the pin was like magic. Not really, but I would tell them that it had a microchip in it, right, that was capable of detecting deception, right? And the reason I was telling them this was I was going to offer them a list of words and phrases, right? Some of them positive sounding, in their connotation, others of them negative sounding in their connotation. Then I was going to ask them to just make a little check mark on the side of the page for whoever popped into their mind, right? So if I gave them a word and the image they got in their head was of a white person, they were to make a check there. And if I gave them a word and the image that they saw in their head was a person of color, they were to make a check there. And I told them that there was this lie detection chip, right? So they'd have to be honest. And the reason, you do this is because people will try to sound a lot hipper and a lot cooler and a lot less racist than they really are. But there's been 20 years of research in the field of social psychology that says if they think you're going to lie detect them, they'll be more honest, right? Because just as people don't want to be seen as racist, but they also really don't want to be seen as liars, right? And so you would, and I told them, oh yeah, it's a microchip. The cops are using it to detect false confessions. It's the newest thing, and this is all, pardon the expression, it's all bullshit. I mean, there's nothing about this that is true, right? And you can make people believe anything with the proper amount of setup. So I'd have my computer and I'd open it up, and I'd start fiddling with the keys like I was calibrating their pins, and I'd look real serious and stern, and then I'd get really concerned. I would say, like to you on the front, I'd say, I don't think your pen is working. Could you take it and just sort of twist the cap about 30 degrees that way? And then they would do it, and I'd say, okay, now you're online. I've got you now. Okay, good. Right, and then I would ask them these words, and one of the phrases that I would use, and you can imagine what some of them might have been, but one of the phrases I would use would be all-American boy or all-American girl, right? And inevitably, particularly when you had the bogus lie detector and they thought it was real. But frankly, even when I didn't do that, right, the vast majority, not only of white folks, but people of color too, would acknowledge that what they saw was a white person. And not just a white person, right? White, blonde hair, blue-eyed, like sort of this prototypical, right, stereotypical white person. And here's the thing. Although I think that's probably going to remain true for the foreseeable future, let's be honest, as that demographic shift continues to happen, right? So that what it means to be an American looks less and less like that prototype. Let's be honest that in 20, 25, 30 years, an all-American boy might be a Latino in the Southwest, an all-American girl, right, might be a Hmong woman in Minnesota, right, might be an Arab Muslim in Dearborn, Michigan, the largest Arab community outside of the so-called Arab world. And I really want us to think for a minute what that means to an awful lot of people in this country, what that would mean to actually have to share that designation of an American with people who look different and pray different and whose cultural traditions are different. Because if you don't think that's a big deal for some folks, right, the idea that, oh no, it's fine, we're more than willing to share that designation, we're more than willing to share that space, right, then you don't understand the psychology of white supremacy, right, and the way that race has sort of burrowed into our thinking about our own normalcy. If I've been able to take for granted that I am the textbook definition of an American, and now I've got to share that with others whose traditions are very different, that has the potential to, in my view, right, come to seem like the club is being opened up to less desirable members. It's no longer as exclusive, as it used to be, right, because now it's being opened up to everyone. And so for a lot of folks, that also generates anxiety, not being able to take your normalcy for granted in the same way. And particularly in a country where white America has long defined our status by the distance that we've been able to put between ourselves and peoples of color. Right? That's been the history, so much so that we know that when people talk about a good neighborhood or a good school, we know that that's code. We know exactly who lives in that neighborhood when people use that kind of phraseology. Right? They may not do it deliberately, it may be implicit, it may be subconscious, but we understand that that's coded language. And in a nation where white America has defined its status by distance, working people, for instance, in labor unions, right, keeping black and brown folk out of their unions, right, even though having them in the union would have strengthened the militancy and the power of that union, but they would keep them out. Why? Because they would say, well, if we let them in, it's gonna reduce the professionalism of our craft. Right? So we are going to define our status by distance, even when having them right next to us on that picket line would make us stronger. Right? And God knows if we don't organize people of color in those same unions, the boss is going to hire them when we go out on strike to break our union and to break our strike and ultimately weaken our labor militancy and weaken our power, right? But we would define our status by that distance. In a country like that, where people have been convinced to think of their interest in these relative and racial terms, not in absolute well-being terms. Right? In a nation where moving out to the suburbs, subsidized by government loans, I should point out, right, or moving west of the Mississippi, subsidized by the Homestead Act, as so many millions of white Americans were, 240 million acres of essentially free land given out after 1862 to such families, $120 billion worth of housing equity loaned preferentially to whites under the FHA and the VA program at a time when people of color could not get in on those loans. Right? That was the marker of success, was being able to move away. Right? So if you think that in a country where that has been true, that we can look at 50% people of color, 50% white country, and not have people get nervous, right? You're just not paying attention, right? Because that means your ability to run, that means your ability to distance yourself becomes much more difficult, right? And if you define your status by that distance and there's nowhere left to run, you just have to confront the reality that your country ain't the country that you grew up in. Oh my God. Right? Keep in mind just how deep this transformation has been. I mean, 25 or 30 years ago, right, you go to grocery stores in most parts of the United States, maybe not in every part of the United States, but in the vast majority of the country, you'd go, and like ethnic food sections, that was like the pasta section, right? That was like spaghetti, right? Ethnic food was Italian food, right? And so people were used, like that was about as far as people wanted to go, right? And now you're talking about going to major cities and even not so major cities, small towns all across the country where you've got authentic Mexican bodegas and where you've got not just, different cuisine, but you've got not just occasional synagogues in the community. Now you've got mosques and you've got Hindu temples, and all of this landscape transformation brings with it a sense to the most powerful people in the country, precisely because they are the most powerful, that things are changing and changing for the worse. Because if you've assumed everything is good, right, any change at all in that direction is the kind of thing that can generate anxiety. Now, even if there were no political movement trying to take advantage of that anxiety, it would likely be generated by those four different pillars of social, cultural, economic, and political change. But into the breach of those changes, what we have is also a conservative movement within the country, aided and abetted by many who call themselves liberal and progressive, but don't challenge that conservative movement around issues of race for fear of somehow making things worse by talking about it. Into that breach of social change comes this conservative movement that quite deliberately pushes those buttons of racial resentment just to make sure that you get the point. Right? So in case the demographic shift and the cultural shift and the black president and the popular culture and the economic meltdown weren't enough to just generate anxiety on its own, they come right behind that and they make sure that you get the point. Right? So a couple of years ago, for instance, you may recall during the healthcare reform debate, right, in which debate race was totally absent from the conversation, if you recall. There was no discussion on the part of those pushing for the reforms that there were racial health disparities that needed to be addressed. They ran from that issue like the plague. No one wanted to talk about that. Race was not in the conversation until Glenn Beck decided to put it into the conversation. Right? Glenn Beck comes on his television show back when he was still relevant. I know he's not now, but back in 2009, he had quite a bit of influence and power. And I remember being at home one summer day, late summer, and he came on television to criticize the healthcare reform bill. And it was fascinating how he did it. It's one thing to argue against a particular piece of legislation on the grounds of cost or on the grounds of efficiency or on the grounds of whether or not you think the government should be involved in healthcare. I mean, honest people can disagree about those things, I suppose, but what he did was fascinating, and it only makes sense within this context of white racial resentment and anxiety. It's the only way in which it makes any sense at all. He looks at the screen, and first off, he says, "Friends, do you want to know what the healthcare debate is really about?" And I was so suckered. I mean, he's a hell of an entertainer, right? I remember thinking, oh my God, we're friends, I remember thinking, I'm going to pay really close attention to this because he's being so nice, He said, "Do you want to know what the healthcare?" And I'm like, yes, I do. And then I remembered, wait, I think I know. I think that the healthcare debate is about healthcare. Something I obviously only believe because I'm an idiot who doesn't possess the superior understanding of a Glenn Beck. He then immediately, as if he heard me mouth the words healthcare, says, "It's not healthcare." And I was freaked out. I was like, oh my God, you heard me. You have a camera, you're looking at me, and it's scary, I was a little paranoid for a minute. And he said, "It's not about healthcare, but I'm going to tell you what it is. This is just this administration's way to get reparations for slavery." Yeah, I really didn't see that coming. I mean, even in the history of asininity that had comprised his entire career, that was like one step beyond anything I would have anticipated, right? And I tried to think about it intellectually. I tried to figure out what in the world is he talking about? Healthcare as reparations for Slavery. I mean, does that sound like a good scam to anyone? Do the black folks in this room really think that's a good plan? Like, is that like, oh yeah, we're going to get our 40 acres and a mule by getting cancer. That's our scam. Like that's really not a very good way to go about it, right? Not a real good plan, but that's what he was saying, and I'm trying to think, it makes no sense to me, right? And then I stopped and I realized, wait, but it actually makes perfect sense. Not intellectually, not analytically, right? It's obviously ridiculous on that level, but politically, that was a genius move. Because what he had just done was look at his audience, overwhelmingly white and reactionary, and basically said to them what? They're coming for your money. And when they get your money, you know who they're going to give it to you, don't you? They're going to give it to those people over there. They're going to say it's for health care, but really it's reparations. And this is just the beginning. This will open up the floodgates, racial redistribution. That was the context that was intended. And in that sense, it made perfect sense. And it fit within the narrative of white racial anxiety and resentment. And a couple of weeks later, Rush Limbaugh said the same thing, and then he tried to up it. He actually went even further. He said that the president was deliberately destroying the economy so as to pay white folks back for slavery. Right, deliberately. Yeah, that makes sense. Barack Obama is going to deliberately destroy the economy, the first and biggest victims of which destruction will actually be black people, just to stick it to whitey. That makes sense. Right, again, intellectually it doesn't make any sense, but politically it is brilliant. Because what he's saying is everything they're doing, right, is just payback. It's why during the election, you'll recall when Colin Powell endorsed Barack Obama, what's the first thing that Rush Limbaugh said on the air the next day to 10 million, 15, 20 million, however many people it is that listen to him? Right? He goes on and he basically accuses Colin Powell of endorsing Barack Obama solely as an act of racial bonding. Right? And why would he do that? Because it's, again, a brilliant political move. What he's saying is, see, even the ones you thought you could trust, right? Even the ones you thought you liked, even the ones that did the bidding of the empire all of their professional lives, even they, when push comes to shove, they're coming for you. They're coming for us, so we have to close ranks and protect ourselves from them. At the very same time, you may recall, when the Tea Party thing actually touched off, most people don't remember what the origins of that actually were, because the folks who were involved in that movement have done a very studious job of sort of rewriting the history to make it sound as if their only concerns are following the strict wording of the Constitution or cutting the deficit so as not to pass on crushing deficits to their children and grandchildren. But if you recall, the actual impetus for this creation of a so-called Tea Party movement, and this is not my interpretation, this is what the Tea Party folks themselves will acknowledge in moments of honesty. They credit that to a guy named Rick Santelli, who is a business reporter, historically has been a business reporter on CNBC, and at the time, in 2009, when the discussion was being had about possibly bailing out homeowners who had been roped into predatory loans, right, charged much higher interest than they should have been, much higher interest than they would have been had they been, let's say, middle class, upper middle class families, right? Folks who had gotten roped in and now found themselves underwater, owning more on their mortgage than what their houses were worth. There was a discussion, it didn't last long, right? You may remember, where the administration was talking about truly doing something to provide real relief to those homeowners. Very little, of course, has actually been done, but the conversation was being had, and Rick Santelli went on CNBC this particular afternoon on the floor of the Mercantile Exchange in Chicago, backed by a bunch of very affluent white men who make their livings moving around money, producing nothing of lasting value and becoming millionaires in the process. That is fascinating, first of all. How that happens. I mean, you got to be a freaking genius to become a millionaire or a billionaire moving around stuff that doesn't even really exist except on paper. That's amazing, right? That's real skill. Those probably have very high SAT scores. These brilliant people like the folks on Wall Street, brilliant people. They lost $12 trillion of other people's money, but they're geniuses, right? They're geniuses. In any event, there's Rick Santelli on the floor of the Mercantile Exchange, and he is going on a rant, which is actually now considered by the Tea Party the rant heard round the world. It's the thing that launches the Tea Party movement. And who was he talking about? He was screaming about this notion that we should help homeowners. And he was saying, in the full range of earshot of these white male exchange folks on the commodities floor, he was talking about, he was asking them, do you want to keep bailing out these losers? And he was referring to homeowners as losers. He wasn't talking about the banks that ripped them off. He wasn't talking about the independent mortgage brokers who did even more to rip them off. These were the folks who would bring you in, right, and give you a loan knowing that you weren't going to be able to afford it, but they didn't give a damn because they knew they were going to sell the loan before you even got home that day. Right? So by the time that you went into foreclosure, they already made their commission. They didn't care. They had no real incentive. They were going to take all of these bad loans, package them into these things called mortgage-backed securities, which they would then sell in lump packages to rich folks. They didn't care if the rich folks lost their money. They didn't care if the poor and working class and middle class folks lost their house. They got paid on day one. And so there was no incentive to treat possible homeowners right. But Rick Santelli didn't care about that. He's talking about the losers who should have known better. That was the rant that began the Tea Party. He said, what we need is a new Tea Party to stop bailing out these losers. Right? So understand that the birth of this movement was born in greed, and it was born in contempt for average, everyday people, peoples of color and white folks. And of course, at that very moment, Fox News was spinning the narrative, going hand in hand with Rick Santelli's discussion of so-called losers, spinning a narrative that the entire housing meltdown had been caused, why? Because of the Community Reinvestment Act, right? Because banks had been forced, in the words of Neil Cavuto, another make-believe economist on television, right? They had been forced to give loans to, as he put it, minorities and other risky folks, when in fact that wasn't true. When in fact the Community Reinvestment Act does not require, force, or even encourage or allow loans to be given to anyone who cannot meet the terms of the loan and who is not qualified for the loan. In fact, people who get loans with the assistance of and as a result of the Community Reinvestment Act actually have lower foreclosure rates than others, right? And we know that most of those programs that are geared toward trying to direct capital and resources into lower and moderate income communities who historically had been overlooked and ignored in the process of capital allocation and mortgages, actually those programs have an incredibly good track record, far lower rates of foreclosure. Groups like Acorn, for instance, much maligned and lied about over the last several years by the same folks in the mainstream media, had a loan qualification program where they actually would sit down and train families to understand, right? How do you pay a mortgage? What are the terms? Understanding the terms. And it was a program so successful that it had a foreclosure rate for the people who got loans with the assistance of Acorn of less than 1%. One of the most successful programs for training homeowners to be able to be responsible with their mortgages of any program out there. But all this time, right, when Glenn Beck is talking about health care as reparations, and Rush Limbaugh is talking about the deliberate destruction of the economy to pay white folks back for slavery. You've got Rick Santelli talking about losers who took out loans they couldn't afford. You got Neil Cavuto blaming essentially financial affirmative action, as he put it, right, for the entire economic crisis. What ties that entire narrative together? It's the notion, once again, that white folks need to be afraid, very afraid of those people because they are wrecking the economy. It's not just that the economy is bad. It's not just that we're facing double-digit unemployment. It's not just that the housing market and the credit markets have collapsed. It's that they collapsed because of those people. So once again, the ability to scapegoat persons of color, low and moderate income folks of all colors, was central to the birth of this modern conservative narrative in the last couple of years. In addition to pushing those deliberate buttons of racial resentment, the other thing that the right has very studiously done is try to develop this nostalgic narrative about the past to which they would like to return. They do it in very subtle ways, right? It's not always blatant. Sometimes it's quite subtle. A couple of years ago, actually, I think it was about a year and a half now, there was an interesting moment on Fox News where Mike Huckabee, the former governor of Arkansas, and occasionally runs for president until he realizes he only has like 12 people to vote for him, and then he changes his mind. He's done that twice. But Mike Huckabee was being interviewed. He actually is a Fox personality himself. He has his own show, but it wasn't on his show. He was being interviewed on someone else's show, and he was trying to explain, in his estimation, the problem with President Obama. And he said, the problem with the president is he just doesn't see America the way we do. And I remember thinking, I've been white a really long time. And I remember thinking, whenever I hear white folks say we, right, we anything, the way we think, the way we are, the way we do things, I start wondering who are they talking about. It's just sort of an instinctual reaction, right? And I remember thinking, now, who is he talking about here? Is he talking about, the president doesn't see America the way that we who are Republicans do? Well, maybe he's saying that, but that would be so obvious, perhaps, as to not really need to be said. So that didn't make a lot of sense. Is he saying, well, he doesn't see it the way Fox News aficionados do? Well, he could mean that, but again, that's sort of obvious, I suppose, and really wouldn't need to be said. Was he talking about we in the sense of former governors of the state of Arkansas? Well, probably not, because there's at least one former governor of the state of Arkansas who sort of does see the world the way Barack Obama does, for good or bad, so he can't be talking about that. So there's really only one category left into which Mike Huckabee belongs. It ain't Republican, it ain't conservative, it ain't Fox News personality, and it's not governor of Arkansas, right? The only thing left is as a white man. And just as I was about to realize and say, aha, now I know what he means, he confirmed it by the next thing he said, right? He says, here's the difference, right? Barack Obama was growing up, first he said in Kenya, he made that mistake, I'm sure, very accidental statement. Then he corrected himself. Oh, I mean Indonesia, right? Because he did spend a little bit of time as a youth, of course, in Indonesia. He said, while Barack Obama was growing up in Indonesia, going to those madrasa schools, or whatever we like to continue to say that he attended when he was there, even though it isn't true. Right? Or even if it would matter if it were true, right? The idea that when he was growing up doing his foreigny brown person thing over in that foreigny place over there, Huckabee didn't actually say it like that, but that was just sort of the implied subtext, right? When he was doing his old foreigny thing, right? We, again with the we were going to Boy Scout meetings and Rotary Club. We were? Who was? Who was doing that? Were black folks on the south side of Chicago doing that? Were they lined up around the block for the Pinewood Derby, whittling little pieces of wood so they could win the race and get a medal or a new sticker or whatever they give you in the Scouts? Were they going to Rotary Club in East Los Angeles? Is that what Latino folks are doing? Is that what they were doing on Pine Ridge Reservation, indigenous people, Lakota peoples, right? Where they couldn't wait to go learn how to do a slip knot, right? So they could get their next badge, right, for the Boy Scouts? Is that really what their life was? And of course the answer is in most cases no. Right? When Mike Huckabee says we were doing that, and what's interesting is it's not even really every white person's story, right? It's not even most white folks' story. If you grew up in an urban area, there's a very good likelihood that that wasn't your reality. If you grew up Italian American in Bensonhurst, if you grew up Irish American in South Boston, that wasn't probably your context. What he's really just done is he's drawn a line around the concept of real Americanism that essentially not only excludes Barack Obama, which is who he intended to exclude from that consideration, but it excludes virtually all people of color in the United States. It excludes virtually all urban people. He's essentially crafting a narrative of America that is small town sort of Mayberry, Andy Griffith stuff, right? That's what he's really saying. And of course, it's somewhat subtle. Not really. It's pretty blatant, I suppose. But right, what he's essentially saying in this somewhat subtle, but perhaps otherwise quite blatant way is that there's this America out there that we have to get back to and that Barack Obama is not a part of. And the people who look like Barack Obama and have names like Barack Obama and daddies like Barack Obama and ultimately the ones who vote for Barack Obama, they're really not part of that real America. That's part of that I want my country back narrative. And then around the same time, Rick Santorum was giving a talk criticizing the president on the issue of health care. And the president the day before, 2 days before, had given a speech somewhere where I suppose he'd mentioned, something about Medicare. He just was talking about the importance of the social policy revolution that Medicare was. And he was trying to hearken back to those days in 1964, for instance, 1965, when Medicare is created, as this important first step toward healthcare security. And of course, he was then saying we need to go beyond that and do more, and that's what I'm trying to do, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, so he gives this rather banal statement about the importance of Medicare, talking about how that was part of the unfulfilled American promise. A very sort of basic political boilerplate kind of talk. And the next day, Rick Santorum attacks him for it, right? And but it's one thing, again, it's one thing to criticize Medicare. If you want to criticize Medicare and say, oh, it's this horrible socialistic big government program, that's what the conservative movement in 64 and 65, they were saying it then. So that's fine if that's what you want to say. If that's the argument you want to make that argument. That's fine. But it was interesting the way that he critiqued the president. It wasn't enough to actually criticize the funding mechanism. It wasn't enough to criticize it as just another big government quote unquote program. The way that Santorum did it was he said, someone needs to tell President Obama that America was a great country before 1965. Now, I want you to think about that in the context of white anxiety, white resentment, I want my country back, nostalgia. Right? For someone to say that this country was great before 1965 requires, above all else, that one be in almost every instance white. Because before 1965, this country was a formal system of white supremacy. It is an informal one today, but it was a formal apartheid country. And that's not my opinion, that is an inarguable fact. A fact about which Rick Santorum, who has 3 educational degrees, even though he calls the president an elitist for having 2, Even he has to know that. So when he says America was great before 1965, he knows what he's saying, and he knows why he's saying it. America wasn't even remotely great before 1965. It's one thing to say we had the potential for greatness. Every country has the potential for greatness. All people have the potential for greatness, but he didn't say it in that sense, did he? He didn't say it in that futuristic kind of tense. He said it in the descriptive and present tense. He said that even when America was an apartheid nation, we were great. And by doing so, he's just rallied subtly, subconsciously, those who have the luxury of believing that to once again hearken back to a time when for them it was, when things were so much simpler, right, and so much easier. And of course, the people who remember those days fondly would lie to the last degree that had anything to do with race. They would tell you it had nothing to do with that, but there's an easy way to know that they're not telling the truth. There's an easy way to know that this nostalgia is racial before it is anything else. And I know this because I got in an argument with a woman who wrote me this very angry email. Imagine that. I'm sure you can imagine that I get some of this. And it was a couple years back. I'd been on CNN and I had made some comment. Again, it was one of these sort of gotcha moments where they ask if the Tea Party's racist and they give you 30 seconds. And so in that 30 seconds, you can't really explain this whole, thing about white racial anxiety and resentment. So you end up sort of focusing on the obvious, blatant examples of racism, which we all saw in the news. People showing up to rallies with pictures of the president with a bone through his nose, dressed like an African witch doctor. That's pretty obvious, right? Or pictures of the White House lawn covered in watermelons sent around as an email. That's pretty obvious. So I had talked about that, and this individual got very angry, and she wrote me this email saying, this has nothing to do with race. We want our country back. When we say that, we're not talking about race. It has nothing to do with that. And I decided I didn't have anything better to do that day, so I was gonna play along, So I asked her, that's fine. I said, tell me then, what is it about? Because I really do want to know, and I don't want to get it wrong, and I certainly don't want to insult you. And she said, well, I appreciate you asking, and I'm going to tell you. She said, when we say we want our country back, we just want to go back to a time when government was small and taxes were low. Right? And I said, okay, that's great, that's fantastic. Would you please pick a date? I need to know the date. She said, what do you mean? I said, well, you don't give me some bumper sticker, right? I need to know when you say you want to take your country back, that is a directional reference. I assume you must have a year in mind. When you think government was sufficiently small and taxes were sufficiently low. So pick a number. What's it going to be? You can't just say it generically. If you actually think that there was such a time, you need to tell me when it is so I can get my head around what you're seeing in your head when you use the phrase. Now, at the time, I didn't actually expect her to write me back so quickly, but in the brief moment that it took before she did send me an email in return, I'd actually scribbled, on a piece of paper what I thought she was going to say, because I knew. I knew, I'm not a betting man, but if I'd been a betting man and if I'd been able to find a bookie willing to take a bet on this particular, I would have cleaned up. Right? She could have said 1897, I guess. I mean, you could say that. I guess technically government was small and it was before the income tax, so I suppose. But come on, nobody's going to say 1897. We understand that in 1897, unless you were one of like 6 white guys or their kids, life pretty much sucked for you. So no one is actually going to say that those were the good old days. He could have said 1911, I suppose. That's before the income tax. But honestly, children were working in factories and mines in the early part of the 1900s. No one is going to say that. Could have said 1924, because even though the income tax had been created, the rates, I guess, were relatively low. Could have said that, but honestly, the 1920s weren't good for most people, not just for black and brown folk, even for most white working people. So I knew she wasn't going to say that. Instead, I scribbled on the page what I thought she would say, and sure enough, she wrote me back and said, well, if I have to pick a year, I guess I would say perhaps 1957. Of course that's what she said. That's the year Leave It to Beaver started. What else would she say? That is the high moment in white media. That is a wonderful time, when white folks could actually pretend that that white women liked doing housework in pearls and heels, right? My God, what a wonderful nostalgic era that was, right? So she said 1957, and I found that fascinating. I wrote her back and I said, well, that's very interesting, because you see, I'm not sure if you're aware of it, but I asked her, I said, what do you think the top marginal tax rate was in 1957? Because remember, her argument was that the reason that the Tea Party wants to go back to those days, like it was in 1957, is because that's when taxes were low and government was small. And I said, well, what do you think the top rate was? She had no idea, so I told her it was 91%, more than double the highest tax bracket that we have now, even if all the Bush tax cuts are allowed to expire. It'll still be less than half of what it was in 1957. Every dollar that you made over $2 million as an individual, $4 million as a family in 1957. Actually, that's $2 and $4 million in current dollars. It was $200,000 and $400,000 at the time. Every dollar that you made as an individual above $200,000 as an individual or $400,000 as a couple, 91 cents of that next dollar went to the government. That's a far higher tax rate. There were actually like 26 different brackets in 1957, 17 of which were higher than anything we have today. So when she says she wants to go back to the late 1950s because that's when taxes were low, she's lying, right? She's lying. That can't possibly be why, because taxes were higher, not just on individuals, but on corporations, both as a share of profits, as a percentage of the overall economy, right? So taxes were far higher. Was government small in 1957? Well, not if you were white. Right? Government has never been small in this country if you were white. It's always been huge, right? That's what the Homestead Act was. You don't give out 240 million acres of somebody else's land by the workings of the free market. That has to be done with a government that has big guns and is willing to use them. Right? So that was big government. The FHA program I talked about before, that was big government. The VA program, the GI Bill, interstate highway construction, which of course made it possible for white folks to leave the cities and move to the suburbs where only we could live, and a program that also resulted, I should point out, in the destruction of 20% of all black and brown housing in the United States when those interstates came through black communities. As happened here and all around the United States. 20%, 1/5 of all housing lived in by black and Latino folks knocked to the ground to make way for interstates and office buildings and shopping malls and parking lots under the notion of urban renewal. Right? All of that, big government subsidizing white flight, big government subsidizing white opportunity, and white folks did not complain about it. Right? These folks who want to go back to the days when taxes were low and government was small actually want to go back to a time when taxes were quite high and government was huge, but only for us. That's why this is about race, you see. It isn't because people are necessarily motivated by overt hatred and bigotry, but they are motivated by a resentment that those programs that for so long were white exclusive have now been opened up to everyone. And it was only when those programs were opened up to others, when people of color began to gain access to the stuff white folks had always had access to, that we discovered our inner libertarian, right? And decided that government intervention in the economy was a bad thing that needed to be resisted. And so what we know is that this narrative about making government smaller and taxes lower, even though it goes all the way back to the founding of the country. There have always been those who argued one or the other side of that particular philosophical divide. But if you have grown up in this country in the last 40 years, make no mistake, that narrative cannot be disentangled from the racial narrative, because the notion of the size of government and the size of the tax burden has been intimately intertwined and interconnected with the racial discussion, because politicians have made sure to connect those things in the public imagination, right? So much so that an international study from just a few years ago that I talk about in my book, Colorblind, which is one of the books that was, if not still, on sale back in the back. This international study found that the one thing that most correlates with the reason that the United States has such a smaller social safety net relative to the other industrial nations that we like to compare ourselves to, mostly European nations, right? The thing that actually explains why our safety net is so much weaker, why we don't have guaranteed health care, why we don't have guaranteed higher education access, why we have so many holes in that system of social support, the primary thing, the most significant factor, is the belief held by large numbers of white Americans that if we had a bigger safety net, those people, in particular black and brown folks, would abuse the program. Right? So in other words, the perception of black and brown cheating those programs, the perception of black and brown over and misuse of those programs is actually the thing that's keeping us from having those programs. Now, what's the irony? Right? The irony is right now we got millions of white folks who need those same programs and don't have them because for the last 40 years they lined up to cut them. They lined up to vote for politicians who promised to cut them because they didn't believe it would ever affect them. We had the ability to believe that it wasn't going to be our problem, it was going to be their problem. And now what's happening? Now we've got communities like Suffolk and Nassau County, Long Island, mostly white middle-class spaces, two of the hardest hit places for home foreclosures. How did that happen? It's very simple. It happened because 25 years ago, or 15, 16 really, when the subprime lending began to take place in black and brown spaces, that was when those mortgage lenders began to rip off folks in black and Latino communities in the early and mid-1990s. The Congressional Black Caucus was trying to get people to pay attention to this. Nobody would. The media wouldn't. Politicians generally would not. And so after 5 or 6 or 10 years, those banks began to look around and they began to realize that no one was going to regulate their activity. In fact, they were being deregulated at that very moment by Democrats and Republicans. Right? So over the course of that 7 or 8, maybe 10-year period, they began to branch out. They realized no one was going to stop them, so why should they stay in the hood? Right? Why do they have to stay downtown, man? They can go out to the suburbs. They can go out to the exurbs. Right? Y'all know what the exurbs are, right? That's the new geographical ring that we've created when we decided that brown folks were too close to us in the suburbs, right? We found out that black folks like Olive Garden too. We were like, oh no, hell no, we gotta move even further out, right? And then the banks were like, cool, we can set up shop out there. We can set up a countrywide location, any damn place you want to live. And so they did, and now white folks started getting roped into those same loans, right? Because we didn't care enough, because of our indifference to the suffering when it was localized, you see. So the point here is that on the one hand, you've got this changing social, demographic, economic, and political situation in America. You've got folks on the right deliberately stoking the fires of white resentment and anxiety in the face of that change, and as a result, pushing for the cutting of programs that millions of white folks are just as in need of and just as dependent on as any peoples of color. And yet, they continue to push for that. You can remember during the healthcare reform debate, they would go to D.C. during the anti-healthcare reform rallies, right? And they would go up to people, right, who were there to oppose healthcare reform. And they would ask them, just straight up, do you have healthcare? And these folks would say, no. Well, do you want some? Well, yeah. Well, are you healthy? Well, no. My blood pressure is 5,000 over 270, and my cholesterol's 10 million, and I'm lucky to even be able to stand up. I've had 3 heart surgeries, 4 strokes. I'll probably die within the week. But I would rather die than have the government provide my health care. There was actually a woman at a town hall meeting in New Orleans for David Vitter, who's the U.S. Senator in Louisiana, one of them. And during the town hall, she stood up. This is a white woman. She stood up. She had 1 baby in her arms. She was pregnant. She said, I just want to say that when I had my first child, I had a really good job and it was all covered, and the whole thing cost me like $200. And then I got fired, and I've lost my job. I haven't been able to find another one. Right now I have no health care, and this next baby is going to cost me, by the time it's all said and done, about $20,000. But I'd rather pay the $20,000 than have the government provide my health care. Now, what do you do with that? We really have to understand that's where we are as a country, because for decades, 2 generations worth of scapegoating, mostly peoples of color and low-income folks of all colors, right, for the economic crisis has so tied our notion of social relief and social support to notions of racial redistribution from the hardworking and deserving to the not so hardworking and not deserving, that now we can't even have an honest conversation about the notion of the public good at all. The notion of the public good is no longer part of our political conversation, so much so that whenever you say public anything, you're in trouble politically. Right? You think there's a reason that the president didn't get much traction when he was talking about health care. He kept using that phrase, the public option. Remember, that didn't last long. Right? Now, of course, there really is no public option in the healthcare reform legislation, but I knew as soon as he used the phrase that the concept was in trouble, because you just can't throw around words like public and not have it connect in people's minds with black and brown folk. Think about it. Public transportation, who rides that? Public housing, who lives in that? Public schools, which children increasingly are in those schools? Public support of any kind has been tied for 2.5 generations in the public imagination to black and brown folk. That's where we are. So when people push those buttons of white anxiety and resentment, we have to understand how that plays out. If your opposition to government spending is linked directly or indirectly to the belief that that spending amounts to a handout going to undeserving peoples of color, you cannot separate that racial narrative from that more general and generic philosophical narrative. So we need to understand that if we are going to respond to these politics of white anxiety and white resentment, we're going to have a very honest conversation about the role that racism has played in moving people away from their actual interests toward their racialized interests, what W.E.B. Du Bois called the psychological wage of whiteness. That's the wage that white folks have been willing to settle for all of these years. Well, I may not have much, but at least I'm not black. I may not have much, but at least I'm not brown. I may not have much, but at least I'm better than that guy over there. Even though you cannot pay your child's college tuition with psychological wages, you cannot pay your medical bills with psychological wages, you cannot pay your mortgage or your rent with psychological wages, and you cannot buy groceries with psychological wages. But when you have nothing else, see, that's the thing about whiteness, right? It creates this false sense of interest. It isn't just that people are voting against their interest, it's that they've been encouraged to define their interest in relative and not absolute terms, right? Looking at whiteness as an alternative form of property, as Cheryl Harris, brilliant law professor at UCLA, has talked about. Whiteness becomes property, just like male identity becomes property, just like being heterosexual becomes a form of alternative property, just like being Christian in a Christian-dominated society becomes a form of property, because whenever you're hurting, right, and whenever you don't have enough money to make the mortgage or pay for your kids' education, it becomes easy to say, well, I may not have much, but at least I'm a big man, in my church, and I'm a big man in my family, and I'm an American, by God, and I speak English, and I'm a Christian, and I'm white, and I'm straight, and I'm male, right? All of those things. You see, those things become alternative forms of property. If we're not willing to have a conversation about that, and about the way that race and whiteness have been instrumental to the false consciousness of American working people, we are never going to move to a different place in this country. We cannot have a conversation about economic justice. We cannot push for, let alone succeed in attaining policies and procedures to bring about economic justice unless we make race central to that conversation in everything that we do. And if our politicians will not do it, and make no mistake, I doubt that they will, we will have to do that. That is our job. It is not the job of the president or the Congress or the media. If they do it, that's fine. If they don't, that's expected. I expect the head of the empire to act like the head of the empire. I'm not shocked when he or she does that. What I do know is that we have to act like the responsible individuals that we know we need to be if we're going to get to that day in 25 or 30 years when half the country are people of color, half are white. If we get to that day and we haven't made significant progress, not just on this conversation, but actually narrowing these disparities, we're not going to be a functional society for anyone. We cannot survive in a country where half the population is twice as likely to be unemployed, 3 times as likely to be poor, 1/20th the net worth, 9 years less life expectancy. That is not a functional recipe for any society, not just for black and brown children, but for white children as well. So we have to make race central to our understanding of our current predicament, rather than keeping it on the periphery as we have tended to do, acting as if somehow it was a separate issue, and let's just address class for a minute. Let's just talk about economics for a minute. Let's try to bring everybody in under the umbrella of economic justice, and if we talk about race, it'll turn people off. If race has been central to why we don't have those policies, running away from that conversation will only allow us to continue to reinforce that denial and reinforce that silence, and we will end up right back where we started. So we have to begin from this day forward demanding that race be something that we talk about whenever and wherever issues of economic and social justice are raised. And I thank you all so very much for coming here tonight. Thank you very much.